Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first lesson on argumentative writing. Our first lesson is going to cover how to choose the correct or proper evidence for your essay. And you might be wondering, why are we starting with choosing evidence in the first place? Shouldn't I write my thesis or write my claim first? I'm going to explain why we start with choosing evidence in just a moment. So here we go. Our first step in choosing evidence, why are we doing this in the first place, is because of this reason. When you're making a point to support your argument, you're really going to need evidence from a credible source to support that point. And so before we can even get to drafting our thesis or our claim or our body paragraphs, we need to start with compiling evidence that supports our ideas. And we also need to consider the argument from both perspectives. So it's going to be important to take into account both what you could potentially argue on your topic and find evidence for the counter argument as well, so that you can make an informed decision. So we are going to talk about two main types of evidence that you could include in your essay, but there's a few other options that I'll allude to that you are welcome to use, but it just might be a little bit harder. So let's start with our first type of evidence. Our first type of evidence is statistical evidence. And if you've ever seen a percentage or any kind of mathematical data in an essay, that is statistical evidence. It is quantitative, which means that we can apply some sort of numerical rating to it. And it is something that can be counted, right? Our testimonial evidence is the second type of evidence that we'll focus on. And testimonial evidence just means that this is evidence that's been quoted from either like a witness to something related to your issue or an authority figure on your issue. So maybe a doctor or a student who had an experience with a book that was banned, right? If you're writing an essay about banned books. And this this evidence is qualitative. So I'm going to show you a quick example of both of these types of evidence, and I'm going to let you try and determine which form is which. Oh, here come my little pictures. There we go. So take a moment and read this and see if you can figure it out. If you guessed that the first example, 99% on-time delivery method, is statistical evidence, you are correct. And then our second piece of evidence here, thanks so much for the super fast delivery service. That is testimonial evidence because it is a quoted statement from someone who experienced the delivery service. Now, I don't know if that is Uber Eats or DoorDash. I don't know what that is, but just an example, right? So these are the two types of evidence that we will focus on for this essay. Statistical evidence can be a variety of different things. It can be surveys, polls, census data, experiment results, economic data, or crime statistics. And if you look over at my infographic on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that this is a really great source to pull statistical evidence from. As I mentioned in class, looking at infographics in general can be really great places to pull statistical evidence. So this is a source I might include if I was looking for evidence about book bans in the US. I can see that my source is the American Library Association, which I know is a very credible place to pull information about books that have been banned. And I can see that this data talks about book censorship attempts in the US and who has tried to initiate those attempts. This has also been published in the year 2020, which means that it's relatively recent, but it might be helpful for me to find some more information that is more relevant or applicable to the year in which I'm writing this essay, which is 2024. But this is a great example of statistical evidence. Testimonial evidence can also be a variety of things. It can be eyewitness accounts, experts on a topic, researchers who have done research into your topic or your issue, or it could also be stories as well. So if you look on the right-hand side of my screen, you'll see that there is a quote from a student named Jack here. This is a source that a student last year quoted from the New York Times, and Jack submitted an editorial to the newspaper. And you can see his quote was cited by the student last year, starting with, "I personally had no queer or trans influences until I was in middle school." So this quote is a testimonial about Jack's personal experience, and it relates to the subclaim that banning books harms students because it limits their identity development. So this person pulled a great quote as an example of testimonial evidence. If you're someone who's like, you know what, Miss Ulea, I know how to quote statistics and facts, I know how to quote stories and testimonies and evidence, take a look here on this screen to see if there's anything that you could extend yourself towards. For example, you could try coming up with a scenario. If you look at the bottom of my screen here, you'll see this person in this example wrote a scenario based on research they did, but they kind of took it to the next level and came up with a fictional scenario for their argument that supported their claim, right? You could also try an example, as you can see in the middle of my screen, or you can tell, kind of similar to the last slide, a pretty specific story or anecdote to prove your point. Our next step in choosing evidence is choosing the best form of evidence. So when we're thinking about selecting the best piece of textual evidence to support our claim, it's going to take a little bit of work. And here are some things we need to keep in mind when we're choosing the best form of evidence to support our claims. First, we need to choose evidence that is relevant to the argument. We also need to choose evidence that is sufficient enough to support your argument. And last but not least, you really need to make sure that your evidence is credible evidence. We're going to talk about all three of these things in a little bit more detail. So when we're thinking about choosing relevant evidence, okay, we want to make sure that the evidence we're pulling actually supports the argument we're trying to make, right? And evidence that is not relevant may still be on the same topic, but it doesn't prove the point that you're trying to make. So let's look at this example here. Imagine that you're trying to convince your parents to let you stay out with your friend for another hour by arguing, here's our claim, that you are responsible and that they can trust you to make good decisions. A piece of evidence that is not super relevant to this argument is saying, I walk the dog anytime you ask, so obviously I can be trusted. Now, doing a household chore kind of shows responsibility, but it's not really the type of evidence that you would need to support the argument that you can go out with your friends for a longer period of time, right? A more relevant piece of evidence to support that argument would be, you've left me home on my own a few times and everything was fine. That proves I'm trustworthy. Since your parents would be able to validate this, they would probably assume that this is solid evidence that you can be trusted in situations where you're unsupervised for longer periods of time. Next, we want to talk about sufficient evidence. Sufficient evidence means that there's enough evidence to support the argument. You might provide some facts or a story that proves your point, but, and here's the caution part here, if it's only a small sample, it won't be super convincing. So let's pretend that you're trying to convince your principal to make school start later, and you argue that students will perform better academically if they wake up later. A piece of evidence that's not super sufficient to support this point would be this first one here. I can personally focus so much better in my later classes. Now, while this might be true for you, and maybe it's true for all students or a few other students, whatever it is, this is only one example, which means it's not super sufficient to support this argument. But a piece of evidence that is sufficient is this Northwestern University study of over 2,000 students. So if you were really trying to persuade your principal to side with you on your argument, you would want to present as much information as you could, right? And so these 2,000 students really help to support the idea that Many students will perform better academically if they wake up later. Last but not least, our credible evidence. To prove that our evidence is credible, we want to, first of all, incorporate it correctly and also make sure it comes from a reliable and unbiased source. So, in order to quote our evidence in a way that makes it appear credible, we want to cite it with MLA citation format. And this is how this works. You include a transition sandwich around your evidence, which includes a lead in to your evidence and then a citation for it. And then you also want to make sure that you properly cite your evidence. If you do not properly cite your evidence, that can be considered plagiarism. So take a look at the MLA format here. I have it all color-coded for you, and we'll take a look at an example in a second. We have our quotation marks in red here, and our quote is in this brownish yellow color. Then we have our parentheses. Notice how there's no punctuation inside the quotation marks. The punctuation lives on the outside of the parentheses. In our parentheses, we have the author's last name and the page number that the information was found. Let's take a look at this example. Thomas Jefferson, an avid supporter of banning books, states in his article, Banned Books United, quote, "I don't think people should gaslight me about censorship," end quote. Jefferson 1. This is a great example of how to cite your evidence correctly. We have our lead-in purple here, which is just a statement about who and where you found the information that you're pulling. Then we have our quotation marks that mark where the quote is. Then we have our parentheses with our author's last name, page number, and parentheses, period. The only punctuation that should go inside your quotation marks is when there is an exclamation point or a question mark in the actual quote. Otherwise, pull that right to the outside. This is how we cite credible evidence. So let's do a little bit of practice. Go ahead and pick the best answer based on this claim. Let's practice again. Go ahead and pick the best piece of evidence to support this claim. One more time. Let's go ahead and practice. Last but not least, let's talk about where we can find evidence in the first place. We've been talking about evidence this whole time, but where do I get it? Just the first place that you're going to look is on our research journal assignment, which will come after the quiz, after this video. So, as you can see on my screenshot here, I have circled in red where you can look for information. The first place to look, and a great place to look, is Gale. Gale is a research database that has a lot of different information to pull from. You can look on the middle school website. You can look on the Opposing Viewpoints site, which was actually really great for argumentation. It'll pull both sides of the argument, evidence for both sides of the argument. You can look at Britannica or the New York Times, the Seattle Times. You could start on Google and try and find articles that support your ideas, but you do need to make sure that those are credible and end with a .org, a .edu, or a .gov. If you get really stuck, you can ask Miss Ulea for support, and I will try and help you research your topic, especially if your topic is really niche and specific. It might be a little bit more challenging to find evidence. But after you complete this video, you're going to move into the quiz for this topic on how to choose evidence correctly. And then you will have access to your research journal and you can start finding evidence. Remember that your evidence should be relevant, sufficient, and credible. See you next time.